So let's start out then here in Malvern. It's an idiosyncratic town, tucked in against the eastern slopes of the Malvern Hills, and quite unlike the nearby country market towns of Herefordshire to the east or Ledbury to the west. They're both lovely in their own way, but they're rooted in their landscapes, their locality and community. Whereas Malvern is full of surprises. It's outward-looking and a place with multiple histories. In the Middle Ages, it was a great religious centre, a popular spa town in Victorian times, and in the 20th century it was the place where radar was developed during the Second World War. And today it's a centre again for technology and scientific experimentation, for sophisticated high-tech industries, as well as for tourism and music. It's all very polite. There's nothing to dismay its handsome Victorian character, its elegant villas as they meander up the lower slopes of the hills to look out over the valley of the River Severn towards Worcester, Bredon Hill and the Cotswolds beyond. In the heart of the town is the great medieval priory church, which has stood here since its foundation in 1085. And take a moment to go inside and make your way past the great fat Norman piers of the nave to the little chapel of St. Anne in the southeast corner of the church. Sitting here, you are surrounded by delicate carving and rich medieval stained glass telling stories of the creation of the world and the adventures of Old Testament patriarchs and prophets. Here there is a sense of stillness and holiness, far removed from the bustle of the busy town. You can't help but be aware that this has been a place of prayer and faith for nearly 1,000 years. I've always loved stained glass. The storytelling is so compact and vital, and the colour, especially of the ancient glass here in Malvern, is amazing. When the light falls through to stain floors, walls, carvings and furniture with reds and blues and greens, it is transformative, it's magical. It alters the nature of a space. And the glass in Malvern is precious. It was made for this church, for this building, 600 years ago. So when you look at one of the windows here to see a crowd of blue cherubim at Abraham's shoulder as he chats with God, just think that it was painted by medieval craftsmen on coloured glass, made and assembled in the 15th century, and still in the building for which it was made. It's not in some museum somewhere, ripped out of its true context, but here, where it belongs. It's extraordinary. And when you look, when you think, it can send shivers down your spine. In the days when the Priory was an important religious centre, Malvern was little more than a village clustered around the great Benedictine monastery. But it was Malvern's location in the landscape which changed its fortunes. Springs of pure water filtered through hundreds of feet of hard granite bubble up all around the town and hills, hills which rise up majestically from the valley to provide vistas of profound beauty. The air is fresh and clean, blowing in from the western hills, and in the 19th century, Malvern found itself perhaps Britain's first true centre of the wellness industry. Drinking and bathing in the pure waters, breathing the clean air, striding up the mighty hills, these were the cures for the ills of Victorian sloth and gluttony. And, a cure was needed. This was a time of gross overindulgence. Well, it was for the affluent classes. So, Malvern found itself a magnet for fashionable metropolitans, escaping sooty, smoky London and all its excesses, and seeking the benefits of the Malvern water cure. And so, the town suddenly found itself famous and rich. Rich enough to build grand villas and public buildings, hotels in the most eclectic and fashionable styles that high Victorian architects could conjure. And the town is still a treasure house of Victorian building, with villas in Italian, French or Gothic style, lining the roads or corralled in their gardens, demure and private behind their hedges and lawns. So the wealthy and overindulged flocked in. Celebrities were frequent visitors, poets, authors, scientists, actors, the rich and famous. The popular author Charles Dickens not only wrote with relish of his characters' feasting, but regularly enjoyed his own favourite dinners of leg of lamb stuffed with oysters, beefsteak and turtle pie, turbot and goose. So, perhaps not surprisingly, he was a regular visitor here. And there were lots of others too. Charles Darwin, the great scientist and author of On the Origin of Species, visited frequently, finding Malvern's regime cured him of his excessive and obviously extremely unpleasant vomiting disease. And when you look around Great Malvern today, you can feel that the place has still got that sense of a spa town. The original water cure hotels are still here. In fact, we passed the most famous one, now known as the Tudor Hotel, on our way out of town. And there is almost a feeling of weirdly being in some kind of miniature Swiss resort. But rather than any fancy treatments, it was probably simply the regime of fresh air, exercise and abstinence which cured most of the patients. But sometimes it was all just too much for people, and if you had to, you could get transported up the hills on a donkey, but you would still enjoy the benefits of fresh air and the beautiful vistas. And trains of donkeys carrying portly Victorians were a familiar sight, winding up the hills. In fact, the donkey stables are still there at the foot of the hills, but they're ruined now and buried away in the woodland. But not even Malvern could cure everyone. In early 1851, a desperate Darwin brought his beloved 10-year-old daughter Annie to the town to find a cure for a ravaging sickness. But she was beyond help. She died in April, and you can still see her grave in the Priory churchyard today. But her parents never wholly recovered from their loss. As Charles wrote, "Oh, that she could now know how deeply, how tenderly we do still and ever shall love her dear joyous face." And the town has a rich cultural life too. The English composer Edward Elgar lived, wrote, walked and played here. He rode his classic sunbeam bicycle, which he called Mr. Phoebus, around the lanes and hills, and completed his most celebrated work, The Dream of Gerontius, in his little haven of peace, his cottage at Birchwood at the northern end of the hills. The writer C.S. Lewis was at school in Malvern, and together with his friend and Oxford colleague J.R.R. Tolkien, he was a regular visitor, staying with some of their many friends in the town. And both were inspired by the landscapes here. Lewis's famous lamppost in the woods of Narnia is a Malvern gas lamp, and you can still see them today in the town and, rather more bizarrely, dotted around the hills. But climbing up from Malvern, to stand on the summit of the hills, look west, and you're looking out over Herefordshire, but you're not just looking out over Herefordshire. You're looking out over Tolkien's Shire, from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. This is the Hobbit's homeland, the gentle, wooded, rural idyll so beloved of Sam Gamgee and Bilbo Baggins. And I can't help feeling that the more I look at these landscapes, visit these hills, the more real Tolkien's world begins to seem. Here we are, standing at the very edge of Middle-earth. And back in the Middle Ages, the poet William Langland, a layman at Malvern Priory, wrote one of the most famous medieval English poems here. Dressing up as a hermit, the poet climbs up into the hills, and falling into a dream, lulled by the sound of a little stream and in a vision, he looks towards the east out over the valley to see a fair field full of folk. And so begins the poem Piers Plowman. Heading south, out of town on the Wells Road towards Ledbury, we pass the Tudor Hotel on our left and we pass Rosebank Gardens with its mounded rhododendrons, and then in less than half a mile we bear right to climb up the eastern face of the Malvern Hills, following signs to Colwell. As the road climbs, the view begins to open up on our left until, at the top, there's a breathtaking vista across the whole of the valley of the River Severn. The Cotswold Hills show as a dark shadow along the horizon, while to the northeast, the open landscape of South Warwickshire and the Arden Forest fades into the mist of the distance. But the road turns sharply to the right, and going through the Witch Cutting, you emerge into Herefordshire, and into a quite different landscape. The Malverns run like a boundary marker between two utterly different aspects of the English landscape. To the east, the open, heavily populated Severn Valley, and an altogether more rural west, the rolling hills rising to meet the distant Welsh mountains. And when you stand on the Malverns Ridge, you feel as if you're astride two quite different worlds. Just after you've passed through the cutting, bear left, passing the Little Arts and Crafts Malvern Free Church, to follow signs to Ledbury. This takes you along the western flank of the hills, and in early May, these slopes are covered with bluebells, an extraordinary wash of deep blue across the slopes, a brilliant contrast to the fresh green of the new foliage on the trees. And straight ahead, you can see the towering ramparts of the massive Iron Age hill fort of British Camp. But these aren't the stone ramparts of a medieval castle. These are the great grassy banks and ditches of prehistory, worked out of the very earth itself, the land cut, modelled and carved, earth piled up into great banks and ditches to create a statement of power and might. And this is one of the great features of the region. It dominates the surrounding countryside. In a minute or so, you reach the main Ledbury Road and cross straight over it to reach British Camp. It's a short, sharp climb along the main path and up a flight of irregular steps, but worth all the effort. You emerge in the northern enclosure of this great and ancient fortress, surrounded by the ditches and ramparts which give the hill its strangely jagged profile and make such a characteristic feature of this eminence for miles around. Walk a few yards over the grass to get the best of the view, and my goodness, what a view it is. It never fails to take my breath away. To the north are the Malverns, stretching away to the Worcestershire Beacon. To the west is Herefordshire, rolling, wooded and still mysterious, with beyond the Welsh mountains dim in the distance. The town of Ledbury is hidden in a fold of the hills, while to the east, the Severn Valley and the Cotswolds, and, nestling down in the lee of the hills, the neat roof and tower of Little Malvern Priory. New archaeological research has begun to reveal that in ancient times, the whole of the Malvern Hills were considered to be a holy place. This was a sacred landscape. These hills are so dominant, they're so abrupt in their appearance from the valleys, and so visible, that they were accorded a special status by the people who lived, worshipped and died in this country thousands of years ago. And standing here, you can understand how this place could be seen to hold a spiritual power. In fact, I find it difficult to stand here and not feel that, because you're standing at the centre of an ancient potency, in an enclosure of earthly power, but on a sacred eminence, and stamping an authority on the landscapes you survey. This is a region rich in ancient monuments, and British Camp is one of two great hill forts in the Malvern Range. The second, on Midsummer Hill, is just to the south, and together they must have wielded enormous influence over the people living in the region. But in spite of all our increase in knowledge and our improved technologies of excavation and analysis, there is still uncertainty about the true purpose of these massive works of ancient engineering. People seem to have lived here. There are traces of Iron Age huts within the great defences, in fact, underneath your feet now. But people never lived here permanently. These were places where people gathered. But for what? For ritual? To assert a tribal identity? To feast? Perhaps for defence? They are certainly strongholds, with complex fortifications of banks and ditches, circuitous, often hidden entrances. But nobody knows for certain. And quite rightly, we need mystery. We need a sense of wonder in our lives. It would be a dead and stale world in which we could audit and rationalise everything. But we do know that we're standing in a landscape which still holds power and influence. So, physically and spiritually refreshed, we turn west to follow the road towards Ledbury.